Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today we're doing one of our deep dives, setting aside the usual noise to really focus on, well, a pivotal figure in missions history, James Hudson Taylor, and the China Inland Mission, or CIM.
That's right. And we're trying to cut through, maybe over a century of discussion about him, about his methods, to ask a pretty central question for us. How does a really radical, on-the-ground strategy stay theologically faithful?
Yeah, fidelity is the key word. Our goal here is pretty specific. I mean, Taylor's methods, you can't deny they were successful in terms of, well, sheer reach in China. But we want to measure them against a higher standard.
Exactly. Not just asking, did it work
Mm-hmm.
in some pragmatic sense, but does it line up with Scripture? And
Yeah.
crucially for our framework, does it align with the standards laid out in the Westminster Confession of Faith? We're looking for those necessary confessional guardrails.
And the source material we're working from really puts forward this twofold idea, this thesis that shapes our whole discussion today. First, and this isn't really debated much, is that Taylor's specific approach, that inland vision, his push for cultural nearness, this prayerful austerity, it just massively widened gospel access in China, opened up areas others weren't reaching.
Absolutely. That part's pretty clear historically. But the second claim, and this is where we really need to dig in, is that the specific model he pioneered, this faith mission idea, which, valued speed, interdenominational cooperation,
Mm-hmm.
well, it created certain vulnerabilities.
Okay.
And that model, because of those vulnerabilities, it needs specific confessional structures, guardrails, if you like, to stop the mission work from sort of drifting away from the church, becoming just a parachurch thing, or adopting maybe flawed ideas about spirituality or holiness.
So if you're out there wrestling with, say, the balance between strategic risk and ministry and, well, biblical prudence, or maybe you just want a clearer picture of how modern missions developed, this deep dive should offer some concrete insights. Let's start by setting the stage. What was the world Taylor stepped into?
Okay, so Hudson Taylor, his lifespan is 1832 to 1905. That puts him right in the heart of the big 19th century evangelical movements. But, we have to start with a kind of uncomfortable historical point. The access he had, the access missionaries got into China, wasn't really granted willingly by the Chinese. It was a byproduct of outside geopolitical forces.
Yeah, that's a tough reality to grapple with, isn't it? That the groundwork for this, spiritual endeavor was tied up with political, even military mechanisms. The doors weren't open just by prayer meetings. They were kind of forced open, often violently, through these imperial treaties after the Opium Wars. That presents a bit of a paradox right away.
It does, and Taylor himself seemed aware of that tension. The access was directly linked to treaties like the Treaty of Tianjin in 1842, then Tianjin in 1858, and the Convention of Peking in 1860. These basically set up the treaty port system.
Ah, the treaty ports, so places like Shanghai, Ningbo, Canton.
Exactly. They became these protected zones where foreigners could live, operate, often under their own laws, extraterritoriality.
Mm.
But the real game changer, the thing that made the CIM possible, was buried in the details of those later treaties, Tianjin and Peking.
What was that specifically?
They didn't just secure the coastal cities, they explicitly granted travel rights for missionaries, specifically missionaries, to move into the interior of China, the vast, largely unknown interior.
Right. Without that specific permission, which was, again, politically enforced, Taylor's whole vision of reaching those inland provinces, it would have been, well, illegal. Impossible, really.
Yeah. So the political groundwork was laid, often through conflict and coercion, and that created a platform, you could say, that the spiritual mission later used. It's a stark reminder, isn't it, that God can work his purposes even through, well, deeply flawed human systems.
Definitely. And while this political access was being hammered out, the world itself was getting smaller, technologically speaking. The sources point out how tech advances really helped this expansion.
Oh, absolutely. Things like improved printing presses made producing tracts, Bibles, much faster and cheaper, huge for dissemination.
And travel itself.
Steam power. Steamships just slashed journey times. And then a really big one, the Suez Canal, opening in 1869, right around when the CIM was getting started. That was huge. Cut weeks, maybe months off the trip from Britain to Asia.
Wow.
And communication, too. The telegraph started linking things up, reducing that sense of total isolation for workers deep inland. All these things, they just lowered the friction, the logistical barriers for getting people out there.
Okay, let's talk about Taylor himself in this period. His first term, 1854 to 1860, he was working for the Chinese Evangelization Society, the CES. This seems to be where he started shaping his own unique methods.
Yes, especially his focus on medical work. He was very strategic about this. He deliberately got medical training, not just out of compassion, but seeing it as a tool. His phrase was something like, to bind wounds and open homes.
So medicine as a bridge builder.
Exactly. In a culture that was, understandably, pretty suspicious of foreigners and their motives, providing practical medical care was a tangible demonstration of goodwill, of love. It was like an acted-out piece of the gospel message, and it got him access, built trust in ways just preaching couldn't initially.
It was also during that first stint, wasn't it, that the break happened with the CES, the thing that really pushed him towards his faith finance idea.
That's right. It was a major turning point. The CES apparently had some financial issues, irregularities. But the critical problem for Taylor on the ground was that the money, the remittances, were often late or sometimes didn't arrive at all. That put him and others in real danger, practically speaking.
Not just inconvenient, but potentially life-threatening.
Absolutely. And for Taylor, it became a crisis point, both practically and theologically. He felt that operating with unsecured debt or relying on these unpredictable organizational pipelines, it wasn't just risky, it damaged the mission's witness. It showed, in his view, a lack of trust in God's direct provision.
So he cut ties.
He did. He made the decision right then to rely solely on God providing through prayer. He refused to go into debt, refused to rely on anything other than what was given in response to prayer. A really radical step.
Astonishing, really, for that time. It shifts him from being just an agent of a society to, well, a kind of theological entrepreneur, doesn't it? And that leads directly to founding the China Inland Mission, the CIM, in 1865.
Yes, founded in Brighton, famously during a time of intense prayer. And its core mission, its charter, was a direct challenge to how things were typically done, while most missions were clustering in the relative safety and comfort of the treaty ports.
The CIM aimed inland.
Right into the unreached interior provinces, the huge, unevangelized heartland. They made it public with the sailing of the Lammermuir Party in 1866. They committed to going where others weren't, accepting the risks, the hardship, the massive logistical challenges that came with it.
Okay, so that inland resolve, that's really the engine driving his whole strategy, isn't it? He seemed genuinely convicted that if God opens a door, you don't just stand there looking at it, especially if the doorway, the coast, is getting crowded.
Exactly. He saw the coastal cities becoming, well, maybe a bit saturated, maybe even insulated from the rest of the country. His goal was maximum geographical reach. Get the gospel out as far and wide as possible quickly. He used methods like itinerancy, constantly moving, and decentralization to achieve that speed.
You mentioned Revelation 3.8 earlier, about the open door. Did he explicitly link his strategy to passages like that?
Oh, yes. He very much saw the political opening, however flawed its origins, as a door God had set before them. And the imperative then was to walk through it urgently. Don't linger at the threshold if the vast interior lies beyond.
But moving inland immediately presented this other major strategic challenge, which led to maybe his most well-known and probably most controversial decision: cultural nearness, adaptation.
Right. Taylor became convinced pretty early on that sticking to Western clothes, Western customs, Western housing created this huge, unnecessary barrier. He called it a moving wall between the missionary and the average Chinese person.
And his solution wasn't just, learning a few phrases. It was quite radical.
Totally radical for the time. He required his workers, men and women, to adopt Chinese dress. For men, that meant shaving the front of the head, growing the queue, the long braid at the back, which was mandated by the Manchu rulers then. It meant eating local food, living in Chinese-style housing, adopting a much simpler domestic life.
Now, you said controversial. I get that it was different, but what was the actual pushback? Weren't other missionaries, maybe even officials, concerned? Like, wasn't adopting the queue potentially dangerous, making you look less like a protected foreigner?
Oh, it caused an absolute uproar among many in the established mission community. They criticized it heavily, called it undignified, unhygienic, even a betrayal of English identity. They saw their Western suits, their compounds as symbols of their status, their treaty-granted protection and authority.
But Taylor saw those same things as obstacles.
Precisely. For him, it wasn't about status. It was about access and identification. His reasoning, as the sources note, was an exegetical judgment. He drew it straight from 1 Corinthians 9. I've become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. He saw Western style as hindering that identification.
So by shedding that foreign patron look, he aimed to recode the missionary's identity. Not an agent of foreign power, but perhaps closer to a local scholar or just an ordinary person.
Yeah.
And that presumably opened doors.
It absolutely did. It gave his workers access to places like inns, homes, villages, tea houses, places where someone looking obviously foreign and perhaps associated with unwelcome powers would simply not be welcome or couldn't even enter.
Okay, that makes sense strategically,
Yeah.
but that kind of deep adaptation, it relies heavily on something else you mentioned, language mastery.
Yes. Crucial. For Taylor, knowing the local vernacular wasn't just a helpful skill, an extra. He considered it the price of admission to the interior. If you're going deep inland, away from the port cities where maybe some English or Pidgin was spoken, you had to speak the language and speak it well.
It seems to connect back to that incarnational idea, like Paul in 1 Corinthians 14 saying, if your trumpet call is unclear, who will prepare for battle if you can't speak intelligibly?
We're just making noise. You
Yeah.
can't communicate the gospel clearly. You can't answer questions deeply. And crucially, you can't effectively train local leaders, which was always Taylor's end goal.
And all of this, the inland travel, the cultural adaptation, the language focus, it demanded a certain lifestyle from the workers themselves, what the sources call frugal mobility.
Right, you couldn't realistically penetrate the deep interior, carrying loads of Western comforts or maintaining an expensive lifestyle. Living simply, often among the poor, was partly a logistical necessity. But Taylor also saw it as vital spiritual discipline. He believed it trained the will for the inevitable hardships. It helped discipline the body and desires, echoing Paul again in 1 Corinthians 9 about not being disqualified after preaching to others. Living simply freed you up to move, to endure, to focus on the work.
Let's shift to the structure of the CIM itself. How is it organized to support this kind of rapid, decentralized movement?
The structure was deliberately lean, especially compared to some older, more established societies. Headquarters, whether in China or back in London, was kept minimal. The key was decentralization,
Meaning?
meaning small teams out on the field were given significant autonomy, wide latitude to make decisions, to move, to open new stations as they saw fit and as providence seemed to lead. Taylor saw the HQ not as a top-down command center dictating every step, but more like a supply artery, providing prayer support, personnel, funds when available, but letting the field teams adapt and respond locally.
Agility was key. Bureaucracy would have just slowed everything down.
Exactly. Speed was essential if the goal was reaching the unreached quickly. And they boosted their reach, their coverage, through another key strategy, the strategic use of women.
This seems quite progressive for the Victorian era.
It was. The sources really highlight this. Taylor deployed women, including many single women, not just in traditional support roles, but right on the front lines. They were involved in medical work, running schools, and crucially, direct evangelism, especially reaching Chinese women in homes and settings where male missionaries often couldn't go due to cultural norms.
So they weren't just helpers, they were opening entirely new avenues for the gospel, multiplying the entry points.
Absolutely. It dramatically increased the mission's reach and impact. And this ties into who they recruited. The personnel selection wasn't limited to, say, ordained ministers with university degrees.
They democratized it a bit.
You could say that. Taylor looked for evidence of genuine piety, physical stamina, a teachable spirit, and crucially, a willingness to embrace the hardships and the cultural adaptation required. He brought in nurses, teachers, tradespeople, people whose qualifications were more about character and willingness than academic pedigree.
But underlying all these methods, all this activity, there was always a specific goal in mind, right? The telos, as the sources put it.
Yes, always. The ultimate aim, the telos of all the itinerating, the adapting, the station planting, was the establishment of self-sustaining local churches led by trained Chinese leaders. The indigenous leadership focus was paramount.
Like Timothy 2.2, entrusting the message to faithful men who will be able to teach others also.
Precisely that verse. The goal wasn't perpetual foreign oversight. It was to plant the gospel, see churches established, and raise up local elders and evangelists who could carry the work forward independently. That was seen as the measure of true success.
Okay, so we see the strategy, the methods, but what fueled this? Sustaining that kind of demanding, high-risk work requires a deep spiritual engine. Where did Taylor and the CIMM workers find their resilience?
Well, fundamentally, it came from a solid theological grounding. Taylor's own conversion experience, his assurance of salvation, wasn't based on, mystical feelings or dramatic events. It was rooted firmly in the objective work of Christ, his promises in Scripture, just as the Westminster Confession outlines it in chapter 11 on justification. That objective anchor was crucial.
So his confidence wasn't easily shaken by circumstances or emotions, and that groundedness seems to have expressed itself through, well, pretty normal Christian habits, what the confession calls the ordinary disciplines of grace, WCF-XEI1.
Exactly. It wasn't about seeking spiritual fireworks or extraordinary
Yep.
experiences. His endurance and what he encouraged in others was built on the steady, consistent use of the means God has appointed for spiritual growth.
Like what, specifically?
Like scripture intake. Just reading the Bible, consistently, widely. Taylor apparently treated it like his essential field manual, the guide for everything in life and ministry, not just a source of occasional inspiration.
Men prayer.
Yes, secret prayer. But again, notice the emphasis. His prayers were very much tied to specific promises found in Scripture. He saw prayer not as a technique to sort of force God's hand or get results, but as a commanded duty, a vital means of communion and dependence on God.
So disciplined, promise-based prayer, not just, wishful thinking.
Right. And alongside private devotion, he maintained the importance of corporate worship. Despite the challenges of constant travel, he stressed maintaining a regular rhythm of Lord's Day worship, gathering together where possible, sticking to that Sabbath pattern. He understood that believers need the stability of corporate means of grace.
That commitment to structure seems important. It wasn't all just fluid movement.
No. And that discipline extended to personal life, like we touched on with frugal living. But it wasn't just about self-denial. It connected to frugality and generosity. Living simply disciplined the will, yes, but he also practiced remarkable generosity, sometimes giving away funds when, humanly speaking, he couldn't afford to.
Why do that? What was the thinking?
He saw it as a way to actively live out his belief in providence, to learn through doing that God's provision is, as the source puts it, a reality to be experienced, not just a doctrine to be affirmed. It was about actively trusting God with resources.
Which brings us right back to that distinctive, maybe notorious financial method, the faith finance approach. It wasn't just a practical choice born of frustration with the CES. It stemmed from a deep theological conviction about providence.
Yes, rooted in the Confession's teaching, WCFV, that God's providence ordains not only the ends he wills, but also the means to achieve those ends. If God willed the CIAM's work, Taylor believed God would also provide the necessary resources through the means he chose, primarily prayer.
So the practice flowed from the conviction. Refuse debt, don't make direct appeals for funds, don't advertise needs. Just pray and trust.
That was the principle. Receive support as God provides it, through whomever he prompts to give. The goal was to model absolute integrity and trust, believing that God would honor that trust, rather than relying on human fundraising techniques or pressure.
Okay, but practically speaking, that sounds incredibly risky. What about emergencies? Sudden needs, building projects, how did they actually function without appeals or budgets in the conventional sense? It must have seemed reckless to other mission boards.
Oh, it absolutely did. Many saw it as irresponsible, even tempting God. Taylor's response wasn't primarily practical, it was theological. If God has called us to this specific work in this specific way, then we must trust him fully to sustain it. They did keep accounts, meticulously apparently, but their confidence wasn't in the bank balance. When funds ran low, the response was intensified prayer.
And did it work? Are there stories of this provision?
The history of the CIM is filled with accounts, stories passed down, of unexpected donations arriving just at the point of crisis, funds appearing seemingly out of nowhere when they were most desperately needed. Whether you attribute each instance directly or not, the consistent testimony was that the needs were met over decades.
This acceptance of financial risk, this reliance on providence, it seems tightly connected to their whole theology of suffering. They didn't seem surprised by hardship.
Not at all. Taylor expected suffering, sickness, opposition, loss, hardship to be a normal part of the mission, not a sign of failure or God's displeasure. He viewed it as ordered by God's sovereign providence, WCFV, something that could even serve the gospel.
How could suffering serve the gospel?
Well, for one, living simply and sharing in the vulnerabilities of the people they served helped break down that barrier of foreign privilege. Unlike missions perhaps perceived as wealthy and protected, CIM workers often experienced hardship alongside the locals. Their vulnerability could be a powerful witness.
And this approach, this willingness to endure, was really tested during the Boxer crisis around 1900, wasn't it? That was a huge wave of anti-foreign, anti-Christian violence.
A massive test. The Boxers specifically targeted foreigners and Chinese Christians, often associating them with unwelcome foreign influence and power. The CIM suffered terrible losses, more missionaries and Chinese converts killed than any other single group. It was devastating.
But did the model itself hold up?
In a tragic way, yes. The sources suggest the CI model proved more resilient in the aftermath because of its principles. Because they lived more integrated lives, dressed locally, and had prioritized training Chinese leaders from the start, the indigenous church structures they'd planted had deeper roots. When the foreign missionaries were killed or forced out, those local churches, though terribly persecuted, were better positioned to survive and continue the work. It tragically vindicated the inland indigenous-focused strategy.
It's a sobering confirmation. Okay, one last point in this section. How did Taylor understand God's guidance? Especially in a time when maybe some were looking for more dramatic signs, the sources call it cessationist sobriety.
Yeah, Taylor operated firmly within a framework that believed the extraordinary sign gifts of the apostles had ceased, so guidance wasn't sought through new revelations, prophecies, or dramatic impressions, which he was apparently quite conscious about.
So how did he discern God's leading?
Primarily through the means God still uses. Careful study of the Word, seeking wisdom from the counsel of other mature believers, and paying attention to providential circumstances, the doors God seemed to open or close. Very much like the pattern you see in Acts 16, where Paul is forbidden by the Spirit to go one way, then guided by circumstance and vision toward Macedonia. Guidance came through wisdom, scripture, and providence working together, not bypassing them.
All right, so we've seen Taylor's strengths. Immense conviction, strategic thinking, this drive for speed and reach. But as the sources argue, that very dynamism, the speed, the interdenominational aspect, the decentralization, it created potential weak spots. It needed structure.
Exactly. This is where we pivot from just describing and, frankly, admiring the methods to applying a confessional critique. The speed and scale, while great for getting the gospel out initially, ran the risk of creating something that lacked long-term ecclesiastical stability. This leads us to Guardrail 1, against parachurch drift and thin ecclesiology.
What does that drift actually look like? What's the danger?
The danger is that you end up with lots of activity, lots of preaching points, maybe many initial conversions, which is wonderful, but you don't actually establish functioning, stable churches. You might have workers doing sporadic baptisms or Lord's Supper, but without proper membership, discipline, or elder oversight.
So lots of motion, but maybe not enough substance for long-term health.
Precisely. It can look impressive on reports, numbers reached, areas covered, but the actual church life is thin. The remedy, drawing straight from the Westminster Confession sections on the church, sacraments, and discipline, WCF XXV XXXY, is insisting that mission work must be intrinsically tied to the church.
Accountable to sending churches and aiming to establish receiving churches.
Yes, under proper elder governance. The metrics need to shift. Success isn't just motion or initial response, it's maturity. Are the biblical marks of a true church present? Is the word being rightly preached? Are the sacraments being rightly administered regularly within the context of gathered worship? Is biblical discipline being duly exercised through accountable membership?
And the end goal, the telos we talked about earlier, has to be clear.
Absolutely. The aim must be the establishment of qualified elders, local leaders ordained to shepherd the flock. That's the sign of a mature, potentially self-sustaining church being planted, not just a mission outpost.
Okay, that's the institutional guardrail. What about the individual worker?
That brings us to Guardrail 2. Against spiritual shortcuts. The intense pressure and demands of the work could create a temptation towards certain kinds of spirituality that promise quick fixes or bypass the ordinary means. The sources mention Keswick-adjacent spirituality.
Can you unpack that a bit? What's the core idea there that's seen as risky?
Well, the Keswick movement, broadly speaking, emphasized a crisis moment of surrender leading to a higher life or instantaneous victory over sin. The risk is that it can subtly shift reliance away from the ongoing work of the Spirit through regular means, towards seeking repeatable crisis experiences or formulas for holiness. It can downplay the lifelong struggle and growth aspect of sanctification.
Right. And the confessional corrective is clear here.
Very clear. It's the doctrine of progressive sanctification, WCF the Sermon. Sanctification is a lifelong work enabled by the Spirit, but pursued through the diligent use of the ordinary means of grace. WCF XCO, Word, sacraments, prayer, fellowship, Lord's Day observance. It's a marathon, not just a series of sprints or crisis moments. That grounds the worker in realistic biblical expectations for growth.
Okay, Guardrail 3 tackles that tension we discussed with cultural adaptation. Guardrail 3. Against doctrinal dilution and syncretism. Being all things to all people has limits.
Huge limits. Cultural nearness is vital, but it must never slide into compromising the gospel message itself. The first line of defense is an absolute refusal to water down core doctrines: sin, judgment, the nature of God, the sufficiency and necessity of Christ's atonement. We have to preach an unaltered gospel, remembering Paul's fierce warning in Galatians 1.
No softening the offense of the cross to make it more culturally palatable.
None. And this extends to worship practices. The regulative principle of worship, WCFXXY, becomes critical here. Adaptation in cultural forms like dress or housing is one thing. Adaptation in the substance or elements of worship is another.
How did this play out specifically in China?
The major issue was often ancestral rites or ancestor veneration. These were deeply embedded in the culture, often presented as mere acts of respect or social cohesion. But theologically, they involved elements of worship directed towards spirits or deceased ancestors. The confessional guardrail, drawing on passages like 1 Corinthians 10 about fleeing idolatry, meant requiring converts to cease participation in these rites, however costly that might be socially. A hard line, but necessary to maintain theological clarity. Yes, and related to that is language precision. Missionaries and local teachers must be careful not to use Chinese terms for God, sin, spirit, etc. in ways that accidentally import non-biblical ideas or metaphysics. Careful catechesis is needed to define terms biblically.
Makes sense. Guardrail 4 brings us back to money. Guardrail 4, against financial unaccountability.
Right. We commend Taylor's desire for integrity and trust in God that drove his faith finance model. But taken out of context, or without structure, what's the risk?
That it becomes a kind of heroic individualism. One person's private prayer life becomes the sole basis for financial operation, without oversight.
Exactly. Faith and integrity are essential, but in the context of the church, they must be paired with accountability. The remedy isn't abandoning trust, but ensuring transparency. This means keeping clear, auditable financial records, having accounts reviewed, and ideally, having budgets approved by the elders of sending or partner churches or a responsible board. Trust is built and maintained through openness.
So faith demonstrated through responsible stewardship and transparency, not just private conviction.
Precisely. Finally, Guardrail 5 addresses the strategic deployment of women.
We noted this was a strength of the CIM using women effectively in various ministries.
Yes, their contribution in medicine, education, and evangelism, especially reaching other women, was invaluable and should be commended and continued. The guardrail, however, comes from maintaining complementarian clarity based on passages like 1 Timothy 2.12 regarding church office.
So affirming women's vital roles in ministry while upholding the principle that the ordained roles of preaching with authority and ruling eldership in the church are reserved for qualified men.
That's the confessional position. It ensures that the mission's zeal to utilize all gifts doesn't inadvertently undermine the biblical structure needed for the long-term health and order of the churches being planted.
Yeah.
#outro.
So, putting it all together, the legacy of Hudson Taylor seems, well, complex, but clear in its lessons. His methods that inland focus, the cultural humility, the prayerful dependence, they offer really valuable models for mission. But crucially, they find their proper place, their endurance, only when they are carefully integrated within and subordinated to the ordinary ministry and structure of Christ's church.
That's the synthesis, I think. The ultimate measure of a missionary method's success isn't found just in its initial speed or how spectacular it looks or the numbers initially reported. It's found in its ability to plant stable, biblically grounded congregations, churches exhibiting those marks we talked about, led by qualified local shepherds. In the long run, maturity outweighs mere motion.
Yeah, that's the key takeaway for you listening. Taylor provides a powerful example of maximizing gospel access. The Westminster Confession, representing biblical church order, provides the framework for maximizing theological fidelity and long-term longevity. You need both.
So maybe we can leave you with this question to think about, reflecting on the challenge Taylor implicitly laid down in his day. Where does the temptation lie for the church today? Are we more drawn to maximizing safety, predictability, measurable results? Maybe a kind of modern coastal model focused on established centers? Or are we willing to embrace the necessary risks, the simplicity, perhaps, of an inland model pushing into harder places, but doing so with a deep commitment to the slow, steady, long obedience required by the ordinary means of grace? Which approach truly honors both the Great Commission's reach and the Church's biblical foundation? Something to chew on.